Welcome, bienvenue to Taking Measure of America, How French Cartographers Shaped the New World with Roger Mummert and Iris DeRode. AFUSA is the largest Alliance Française network in the world, helping 26,000 learners of French each year learn French, live French, and love French. Take a look at our little video. Visit our website, afusa.org, to hear about some of the wonderful programming we have coming up. Peter de Bruges of Variety Magazine will be back with Petit Maman. We have a wonderful theater program for Queens coming up on March 12th. And I'm very excited to say that we spoke with Thomas Schlesser, and he will be with us to talk about his new book that has hit the world by storm, Les Yeux de Mona, Mona's Eyes. So go to afusa.org for more information. A few logistics and format. Please stay on mute during the presentation. Stay on speaker view. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll hope to get to them at the end. And if you have any technical issues, please sign back in after a few moments using the original Zoom link. This event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and the total runtime today will be 1 hour and 15 minutes. I'm thrilled and honored to introduce today Iris DeRode. Iris is an historian specializing in the French role in the American Revolution. She is the author of an award-winning book in 2022 on Châteauroux, recipient of the Prix Guizot from the Académie Française in 2023. Featured in Ken Burns' The American Revolution, Iris is the advisor to major museums and digital heritage projects and is currently completing a new book on the French in the American Revolution. And we're equally as thrilled to welcome back Roger Mummert. Roger is the creator of the ParisProject.net, which explores the history of Paris as a city of ideas. Roger has done many AF national presentations, I think 7, including Paris, a City of Ideas, Myths and Mysteries of the Bastille, D-Day and the Soul of France, and many more, all available on the AFUSA YouTube channel. Roger's writing on culture, literature, and travel can be found in the archives of the New York Times and elsewhere. Welcome, Roger, and welcome, Iris.
Oh, thank you so much, Renee. And thank you to the Alliance Française for making today possible. As Renee mentioned, if you've seen Iris in Ken Burns' series on the American Revolution, it's terrific. And Iris offers some wonderful insights on France's military role in the birth of America. And here today, we're going to take a look at a different side of that same story. We examine how maps drawn by French explorers and cartographers, incredibly detailed and beautiful maps, articulated the borders and rich interior features of a continent largely unknown to non-natives. We examine here the power of maps in all of this, how drawing a line on a piece of paper begins the transformation of wilderness into property, a political state, an extension of culture. And we look closely at how France's unsurpassed excellence at map-making eliminated its vast claims and how that may have led to the very demise of French America. We explore that now as we take measure of America. Melissa, if we go to the next slide, please. The Age of Discovery. Can we move forward? From the 15th through the 17th centuries, Europeans reached the shores of America in what was known as the Age of Discovery. European explorers meticulously charted and mapped what they called the New World. They did so on behalf of their mother nations, which claimed vast portions of this newly discovered land of virgin forests, fertile fields, broad waterways, and bountiful fish and game. Uh-oh, we got a nomenclature check here. Pull it over. I've just used a number of terms and concepts commonly heard that reflect an egregious level of Eurocentrism. It's the kind of language I heard in history class many years ago. Columbus discovers the New World, discovers America, Indians, frontiers, how the West was won, those kinds of things. And this is abundantly reflected in the images that we see here, these depictions of natives. If you notice, they look just like Europeans, and they're going about their ways of shooting game here, living their lives, perhaps doing agriculture, all looking quite bucolic and very inviting. Let's look at the next slide because we see two versions of how Europeans may have seen, as we know, Europeans saw the native people they encountered, and how that was seen from the other point of view. Next slide, please. As we get to it, the next slide will show Amerigo Vespucci awakening America. Can we get to that slide, Melissa? Oh boy. Yes?
Can you see this line, Roger?
No, I can't see it, but okay, is it there? I see
Yeah.
perceptions of the new world. Oh, two perspectives. Okay, here are the two perspectives on what we might call the first encounter. We have on the left a portrait called Amerigo Vespucci Awakens a Sleeping America. This is also known by the name The Allegory of America. And on the right, the discovery of Brazil, seemingly from the other point of view. Now, both of these depictions are by European artists, but looking at the left one with Amerigo Vespucci, the implications of European superiority are just colossal here. They barely don't even need commentary. We see Vespucci arriving. He's holding a measuring instrument, so he's bringing science. He's dressed as if he's royalty. He's got a staff there with a cross at the top, so he's bringing religion as well. And as we later know, he also is bringing disease and slavery to a native who's naked and lying in a hammock, kind of wasting away the day, while Amerigo Vespucci represents the superiority of this European culture that is being brought to the savages of the Americas, so to speak. Now, on the right, we have the opposite point of view, a portrait painted around 1900 by a Portuguese artist. Of course, the Portuguese settled Brazil. It's called The Discovery of Brazil. And this shows native people looking on as explorers are reaching their shores and what they may have thought of these explorers, especially what they may have thought them afterward when they became settlers. So this is a picture of native people. And for all the people that, want to get the brown out of America, as they say, take a look at what America looked like when Europeans came here. So the discovery of Brazil and the allegory of America. So when we talk about discovery and new world, terms like this, we have to really put them to rest and talk about first encounters. Now, if we can go to the next slide, we show, well, let's talk about this. Maps tell stories. Do we have that? Two perspectives. Yeah, maps tell stories as we get to the next slide. These are two representations of the same area, largely the northeast of the United States and eastern Canada. And they're depicted as they were in the mid-17th century, but they tell very different stories. There's a European perspective that shows shorelines, inlets, fishing grounds, navigable rivers, and the presence of natives. Now, what's noted here are mostly things, yes, on the left here, that have economic and social implications. Now, the native perspective in a modern rendering shows the prominence of natives and the delineated native territories. This is the same area as on the left, but it shows that this was an area completely occupied by different nations, well-established nations. In the center and just under Lake Ontario, if you can locate that, is the Haudenosaunee, which is also known as the Iroquois Confederation of 5 and then 6 nations. Now, just to put this into perspective, at first contact, the Iroquois Confederacy was a system of society and government that went back 500 years, a stable system of government, you might say. And it had a fighting force of 5,000 native warriors. It was the largest fighting force that we'd see on these shores until the Revolutionary War. And these were people who had been in place for 13 to 14,000 years and were the descendants of people who had built enormous cities, such as the city of Mexico, cities in the sky in Peru, and the pyramids of Central America, but also closer to home, the giant mounds of the Midwest. We don't even know much about the ancient culture that preceded these people, but yet the explorers were reaching a land with a people that had been here for 13 to 14,000 years. Well, let's talk about population. At first contact, 1500, there were 50 to 60 million Native Americans. Let's just call them Americans. In other words, in North, Central, and South America, there were 50 to 60 million people. Now, most of that was located in Mexico and South America, but north of the Rio Grande, the area that we're going to talk about today, with the U.S. and Canada, had 2 to 4 million native people, encountering settlers who came from Europe, a place of 70 to 90 million population, and arrived 52 at a time, 50 to a boat. That's 2 to 4 million people encountering people 50 at a time, encountering Europeans. If we zoom forward to 1700, it's a different story. The native populations have been decimated, certainly in Mexico, but also north of the Rio Grande, we have native population reduced to just several hundred thousand, maybe as many as a million. The British colonists at this time numbered 250,000, the French colonists 15 to 20,000. If we go forward to 1750, there's been a boom in the British colonies that have reached 1.2 million, whereas French settlers are somewhere between 50 and 100,000. So, who's winning the population game? The British are winning, Nouvelle France is foundering, and the natives are decimated. So that puts into perspective what we're talking about. Also, I wanted to go to something that Iris we had talked about, and that is what were the Europeans thinking of the native people that they encountered? And there was one interesting point of the time that you had mentioned, then that Europeans, if we're talking about in this era through the Enlightenment, had notions about climate that was related to intelligence and related to the development of societies. Can you tell us something about that, the climate theory that was enumerated by Montesquieu and others?
Yes. First of all, thank you for inviting me to have some comments in this larger presentation on the world in maps. And so, of course, studying the French-American relations, maps are very important. And what you're referring to, the theory of climate, is a important theory of the 18th century. So the maps we have on here are, of course, from the 1650s. So I'm going to talk about a later period, which is, of course, the middle of the 18th century. So the 1750s, 60s, 70s. And what you can see, particularly in France, is a theory that's emerging out of originally some more Dutch text. His name was De Pauw, and some other authors of the time. And it was especially taken over afterwards by a man called Montesquieu, that you might have heard of, the famous philosopher Montesquieu. And then others called Renal also were influential in spreading the theory that was already established a bit further before that. And so this theory claimed something, which was in order to understand the world, you have to, as a very enlightened way, of course, of thinking, was a period of the Enlightenment, the moment when people started to wonder about almost everything and trying to think about them for themselves. And so one of the things was looking at maps, looking at the world, and understand why people were so different. As we have heard, we had a very Eurocentric approach, a very superior sort of thinking approach where people would try to explain why Europe was so superior to other locations. One of the explanations was climate. And with climate, I mean the environment, climate of the people where they were living in. So when it was hot, they would become lazy. When it was cold, they would work harder. So especially those in France or Northern Europe, the Netherlands, people thought because it's so cold here, we tend to work harder. We're going to find ways to produce more food. We're more industrious, all these different things because they believed climate really shaped that. And so to explain that, for instance, Native American tribes were inferior in their opinion, they would say, of course, it's too humid and too warm in America. And so that has led to to brains to shrink, literally. Everything, the entire body, a lot of places were shrunk compared to Europeans. And it led to phrases such as the climate has never been able to produce poets or artists or more advanced thinking in North America, especially. And so this is a theory that sounds quite hilarious today because it just doesn't make much sense. But or it also sounds very racist, obviously, but it is one of these ideas that for us today would not make sense, but at the time it was very popular. And at the time of the American Revolution, when the French were starting to get interested and to think, are we going to support the American Revolution? This thought and this theory became an obstacle for that because they thought, why would we help people that are smaller in every capacity than we are? And this didn't only apply to Native Americans because that's how it started to be explained, but they also started to look at Europeans that would, as they call it, transplant themselves to America. It would happen to them as well. So this meant that as a French or Spanish, Italian, German person would come to North America, their capacities of thinking would diminish because of the climate. And so in a few generations, all was lost. And so, of course, this was soon countered, this whole thing. So during the Seven Years' War, but especially the American Revolution, when a lot of French went to America, they started to realize it was completely false. They saw, for instance, animals were also believed to be smaller. They saw very large animals, and they met especially a lot of very important intellectuals of the time and realized, oh, we were really wrong. So it's a very interesting way of how you can imagine a world if you've never been there. If you only look at maps, you might start to think, all these people and creatures living in other places. But as soon as you go, you realize it's not true. So I think this is an interesting way of indeed talking about maps and about theories and then proving them not true when you actually start traveling.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that. Yeah, we'll see a lot of maps that are highly illustrated, and they show a great deal of the activity of the people that lived in a world that was unknown to Europeans. And take note of how they're depicted. We said earlier the depiction of native peoples was very European looking. There are other maps in which they're depicted as looking kind of Chinese or Mongolian because there was a belief, of course, some of the early explorers thought they were in China or were in the Far East and so forth. So take a look at the depictions of humans as we go along. Let's go to the next map and the back to Eurocentrism, the age of European exploration. Instead of calling it the age of discovery, now we're talking about Europeans exploring the world. And this chart, if you can see that, is kind of the greatest hits, beginning with in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue and going right up to the end of the Ancien regime. But it shows a couple of things very clearly. And those who sailed for France, I've put into bold. And I think you can see at a glance two things. One, that France was behind the eight ball as far as this goes. We lagged behind, France lagged behind England and Spain and Portugal in terms of getting to the Americas. And secondly, there was inconsistency, great periods of time in between the first couple of explorers, that is to say, Verrazano and Cartier sailing for France, and those who came after, all the way to Champlain, a 70-year gap before there was really any settlement in the part of the Americas that France controlled. That was what we know largely as Eastern Canada and Ontario to the Great Lakes, Nouvelle France as it came to be known. So France was late to get started and inconsistent in its support for that. If we can go to the next slide, along with the age of European exploration comes the age of cartography. It goes hand in hand. The explorers, part of their task was, of course, to find new lands, but also and new routes, but also to chart them and to claim them. And for that, you needed cartography. And many of these explorers some were cartographers themselves, but others traveled with cartographers aboard, and those back in France who would render their on-the-spot maps into something far grander. So as we see here, the age of cartography went hand in hand. Now, again, the role of maps is something very interesting. It's said that in the year 1400 in Europe, maps were little used and little understood as well. But by 1600, the period we're talking about with François in France, maps were absolutely essential. They were essential to the sense of a country. They were essential to the church. They mapped what was within the dominion so that people could be counted and could be taxed and could be ruled over. So again, they became extremely important. In colonial America, maps were little used, but they became vital by the 18th century with the French and Indian Wars that we're going to talk about, and the borders being drawn of this new emerging nation called the United States. So, also, as we look at this, there's something that I wanted to be aware of, and that is a French concept called histoire d'en bas, history from below. It's reinforced by a lot of thinkers in England and the United States. Also, Robert Darnton being one that I know, Iris, you've mentioned in terms of social history. That we should not be just talking about this period in terms of these great men who at great times for great leaders sailed in big ships to accomplish these great tasks. There was also life going on there. So, what did a map mean to somebody in a village in France, somebody who perhaps never would leave their village in their entire life? It's something to think about. But, Iris, did you have a thought on that, on history from below?
Absolutely, and I think it refers a lot to what you just said about Eurocentric thinking. It's not necessarily the same, it comes from the same type of mindset of thinking. It's always about the great men of history and the superior Europeans versus the rest of the world sort of thinking. And this is in like the 1950s and 60s. There was in France in particular a group called Les Annales, and they were highly, of course, associated to Georges Lefebvre, who has been mentioned, who wrote several books on the French Revolution and explaining it not just through the lens of high politics and a few of the main leaders. He would look at the normal people, the common people, the farmers, the local populations of different villages, and start to understand their emotions, their social structures, and not to explain all the big events of history only through the large sort of socioeconomic, political, geopolitical movements. He would look at individuals that played roles that were before that completely ignored most of the time. Um, Today, that is very common to do, to look at, history from below. But at the time, that was very quite revolutionary. But it led to a whole new wave in history on the many people that had been forgotten before that. And as you say, you could say it's kind of a bridge of thinking between political and the great men of history towards a more social approach. And there's many other examples, but indeed, Robert Darnton is also one of the leaders in social history. He's in the US. And he, of course, wrote books a lot about, well, books about books, but it's on the
Yeah.
circulation of books that he is mainly specialized, and which means you're studying the reading culture, the perception of particular books. And for instance, if you talk about the French Enlightenment, you will think of names like Montesquieu and Voltaire and Rousseau, but there was a huge undercurrent under these large thinkers, these big names of, a lot of normal people writing or lesser known figures writing, or especially also looking at what is a readership? How do they interpret these texts? What do they do with them? Who produced the texts? How does that shape politics or public opinion and all these different questions? So what you can see is really that shift. And I think what you're describing is interesting is in the way sort of a parallel is the shift between the different ways of looking at America by Europeans. That is also, of course, shifting. But historians needed a bit more time for that to understand that you can look at a lot of different ways in different
Oh, yes,
sources.
that's a wonderful thought. We'll try, and it's something that we slip into the great men, great moments theory inevitably, but it's something to always be aware of. If we go to the next slide and show the globe, I'd like to catch up. I have a note here that maybe the slides are lagging behind our discussion. Do we have the globe up after the eight? Yeah, the globe. Okay, we're good. So, along with maps came globes. And this was another way of somebody who perhaps didn't know how to read a map could grasp a concept that the Earth was round, indeed, that explorers were not going to fall off the edge of the Earth when they got to the horizon and so forth. These are three famous globes from around the time of first contact. The Aired Apple or Earth Apple globe, 1492, a beautiful work. The ostrich egg globe, so named because it's made of the bottoms of two ostrich eggs that are round, and then the Hunt Lennox globe, 1508, which is made of copper. I have actually handled this globe at the New York Public Library, and if you can put it in perspective, it's only about 5 inches tall. So, but it is made of copper and has incredible detail on it. And I chose these three maps because they showed what the Europeans knew of the New World, as they called it, or the Americas and so forth. So the Aired Apple Globe, 1490, we're just before Columbus, of course. Does anything exist in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in between Europe and China? There's one island that would be presumably Japan, just off of China. No knowledge of the Americas existing there, even though there were earlier explorations to South America and such. The ostrich egg, 1504, shows that now Europeans have a good sense of South America existing. And from early on, we see islands there that are identifiable as Cuba and Hispaniola. And just a few years after that, we're beginning to fill in the pictures of some things being there, that there being North America. So I think these globes tell a great story. If we could go to the next slide, it's about, the Dieppe School of Cartography. We're now in the 16th century. This is the 1500s, just after these first explorers, the European explorers, set out. There was a school of cartography that existed in the port city of Dieppe. Now, this was a center for map makers. Yes, it was a center for sailors, mariners, and specifically, there was a group of map makers known as hydrographers. Now, maps were very important to the mariners. Maps were largely about sailing and ports and so forth. In fact, they were referred to as portolan maps, referring to ports. They showed the sailing routes and the points of arrival. So Dieppe map makers based much of their work on the knowledge of Portuguese map makers and mariners who also came to Dieppe. And it suggested that the Dieppe map makers, the prominent ones are mentioned at the bottom here, may have paid the Portuguese for their knowledge of the oceans and of the New World. This was in violation of Portugal's policy of silence. But yet, this area of map making was one of secrets and well-kept secrets. So Dieppe maps were very large. They were handmade and produced on order for François I of France and Henry VIII of England in particular, richly illustrated with human activities. Well, let's go to the next one. We'll see some examples of this. The Dieppe School of Cartography, which gave rise to the Atlas, which is a very interesting development in this. If we can see, do we see the Atlas, the emergence of the Atlas? The Vallard Atlas and the Rotes Atlas both come out of the Dieppe School. We show here also the Miller Atlas, which was a Portuguese work. And yes, there we go. These I examined in the New York Public Library. And these are very high quality reproductions of these atlases from the 16th century. And as you can see, that they depict not just shorelines with a great deal of detail, but rather the activities of the people who populate those areas. The Dieppe maps were known for their accuracy at the time. They included a compass rose, a point of orientation toward the north, although you have to be careful when you read some of these. Some of the maps are oriented south, upside down, so to speak, and they included rum lines with these routes of sail by which the mariners would set their route and travel from one point to another. So these were very much portolan maps, as it meant for sailors. But as time went on, the illustrations of these became kind of real estate brochures. They were, as I say, scorecards of empire. They were not just navigational guides, but they showed lands where nations wanted to establish settlements and so forth. So they depicted in many cases these kind of rosy scenarios of what life was like there. Let's take a look at the next couple of slides. We can see some more detail. The first being the settlement of St. Lawrence River, or along the St. Lawrence River. This is this is drawn from the Vallard Atlas. By the way, these atlases are named not for the people who created them, but rather for early owners of these documents. Can we get to the settlement of the St. Lawrence River? Because it shows, yes, in a kind of Norman Rockwell kind of scenario here, what is going on. And this I just find so rich in content. First, let's orient ourselves. Top left, you see the compass rose, and the top of the compass rose, or rather the bottom here, is the fleur de lis. It's pointing downward. That means we're oriented south. So, if you will, we're standing at the North Pole looking down to the area of the St. Lawrence Seaway. Here it's called the Rio de Canada because it's probably drawn by someone Portuguese. And we're seeing Newfoundland and Nova Scotia there, and we're looking down the whole coastline toward Boston, if you will. But I find this map to be just so telling for many different reasons. The center of the map is a settlement of Europeans who are here, and they're dressed as if they're in they're going to a coronation or something. Beautiful outfits. There's men and women, and they seem very happy, even though they're all carrying pikes and halberds. So I guess they're a little on edge. You see their fort there is fortified with a fence and with cannons pointed outward. And they're surrounded by native people who, on the left, just look friendly as could be. On the right, well, they look like they may be stirring up some trouble there. But that's set off by the very adorable bears at the lower right of this. And at top, the natives are just bagging some deer here, which is so plentiful, the food just kind of runs by and you take it. Now, this portrait is wrong in a whole lot of ways. First of all, the settlement would not have had any women really to speak of, and certainly they would not be dressed as if they're going to, as I said, a coronation or something. It's wrong in that sense, but it is an example of a kind of real estate brochure, if you will, of what settlement is like in the New World and the plenitude that we see here. There's all sorts of economic markers here. What's the abundance of the trees? Lumber was very of great value. There's game, obviously plentiful game. Off the shores, there's the fishery, which produced the cod that was salted and dried and so forth. And historians point out another thing. There are these docile natives that could be taken as slaves and were. Some early explorers did take back some native people from the area of Quebec and kind of put them on display in Europe. Some were returned to their native lands. Let's go to the next slide because it shows a little bit more of what we've been talking about in terms of the richness of the land. And in fact, I think, Iris, you'll note the largeness of the oxen or what looks like domesticated animals, cows or something, at the lower right of the next picture from the Rotes Atlas, North America Detail. Do we have that? We get sticky keys today?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. It's
You should
another
see it now.
illustration. Yeah, I should see it now. It says North American Detail Rotes Atlas. Do we have that? Well, okay. Yes, right. So this is just another depiction, and it's typical of how everything was kind of from a European perspective. The people that were there were somewhat European looking. In some of the early maps, you see kind of churches and so forth in the in the distance, which is just jarring, but it speaks to this is a civilized land with a land of plenty. So if we go to the next map, we begin a new chapter here, the French presence in the known world, and that is sailing with Verrazano. In history, there are no beginnings, just starting points. Am I right about that, Iris? You avoid the term in the beginning. So our starting point is with Giovanni di Verrazzano, 1491 to 1528. He was not French, but Italian, a Florentine who lived most of his life in France. And in fact, he lived in Dieppe, moved there in 1506 and worked as a navigator. In 1508, he sailed to Newfoundland with another captain and possibly had his first look at the St. Lawrence Seaway and the river. But it was in 1524 that Verrazano departed Dieppe on his ship La Dauphine to explore the east coast of North America. The voyage was requested by Francois I, but was financed by Florentine silk merchants in Lyon and Rouen. They sought passageway to China to facilitate the silk and spice trading. Now, Verrazano's mission was to explore the East Coast, and the maps that came from his voyage greatly helped Europeans to understand the parameters of the North American continent. And they set the foundation for a knowledge base that France would have, a knowledge base that would exceed all other nations. We go to the next slide, we see more specifically what we're talking about. Um, and it's notable that when Verrazano sailed in 1524, there existed probably at least 30 maps of the New World, as Europeans called it. And as a navigator and a resident of Dieppe, where maps were produced, why Verrazano likely knew them well. Now, the one at left is notable, the World Map 1507 by Wald C. Müller. It's notable for a couple of things. One, this is the first use of America on a map of the New World, and it's taken, of course, from Amerigo Vespucci, who I think historians feel was oversold as a significant player in this whole story. He did go to the northern coast of South America, never set foot in North America, but citing his earlier voyage, why this 1507 map or world map shows a pretty delineated South America, Caribbean, and parts of Mexico, and the first suggestion that there's a significant amount of land in North America. You see the extension of Florida down there just above what would be depicting Cuba. So this is what it looked like, the known world when Verrazano sailed. And after he sailed, this is what it looked like in a map on the right by his brother, Girolamo, who probably went along with him. It's not absolutely certain, but he drew in the details from his brother's map, the navigator's map, that show everything that was explored along the East Coast, further north from where the Spaniards were. He sailed to about the Carolinas and then north to the shores of Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, before returning to England. So I'm sorry, to France. But I often think of Verrazano's journey as kind of like when I sit down with my sister to do one of those crazy puzzles. It's got 1,000 pieces. What do you do first? You get all the pieces that have the straight edge to them. You do the frame. Well, Verrazano kind of filled in that frame, everything that was above this point of Spanish exploration. And in fact, below this point, if you follow down this line from Verrazano's map, 1529, below that is La Florida, and above that is Francesca. So Francesca, or on that's as Giovanni called it, or his brother Girolamo called it Nova Gallia, for New France. So these are the claims of the French first expressed on a map. Let's go to the next map if we could. And we'll see that there was a problem with Girolamo's map and with Verrazano's journey. In fact, it turned into an enormous canard that showed up on other maps for the next 100 years. That was called the Sea of Verrazano. Okay, so here's a close-up of Girolamo's map on the left, in which we see a kind of narrowing at the point where it's Florida below and it's Francesca above, a kind of pinch point where Verrazano saw an opening that he thought was the route to China. Now, years later, here's a depiction of that very thing happening. If you can imagine the large ship in the foreground as being Verrazano's ship. He arrived in the Carolinas and he encountered the barrier islands of the Outer Banks and saw through to some of the bays that might have been, that appear to be open water and that flowed very much into the heartland of America. Now, Verrazano did not stop and take time to explore this. He's been faulted for that. What if he had? The French might have settled where the English later settled the Virginia colony, but it was too shallow, it was too treacherous to go in, so he did not explore what was an opening. And you can say, well, he missed an opportunity to claim land for France and establish settlement, but on the other hand, his mandate also was to chart the whole east coast of America. So let's go to the next couple of slides because we see how maps can not lie, but they can rhyme and they can replicate some of the inaccuracies of early observation. Can we see the next map, please? It'll show the Sea of Verrazzano by Maggiolo. Yes. Now, Maggiolo was an Italian. He likely sailed with Verrazzano, was on board, and he created this map from Girolamo's Verrazzano's map before it. It fills in blue what was believed to be this Sea of Verrazzano, that just 6 to 7 miles inland from this point in the Carolinas, there was an enormous sea that led to the Pacific, and then it was a hop, skip, and a jump to China. In fact, if we look at some of the writing here, I flipped it around because half of the map is upside down, but starting at the bottom right, you see, of course, Cuba, you see La Florida, what we recognize, the peninsula of Florida. Then this pinch point, that very narrowing before we get to the Sea of Verrazzano. Above that is Terra de Francesca, the French claims. On the left, we see the Gulf of Yucatan. Now, that's interesting. My sister and her husband are anthropologists in Mexico. They just led a group to the Yucatan to see ruins there. They said Yucatan was a misnomer. It's Yucatan here, but we're talking about the same body of water. And to the left of that, we see the great city of Mexico. Above that, we see something written about land that's incognito. And at the left, if I have this right, and it's my conjecture, it says Novus Indienne, or ships from India that are arriving, coming from this never happened, was not observed certainly, but this is just a conjecture, a kind of fantasy that this pinch point surely leads to waters that lead to China. And this was copied again and again. If we see in the next map, on an English map and a German map, they replicate this Sea of Verrazzano. First, a map by the Englishman Michael Locke, and second, a map of the Neue Welt, a German portrayal by Sebastian Münster, that both have this narrowing, this pinch point, and lead to the Sea of Verrazzano. In fact, there on the left, it says Mare de Verrazzano. And on the right, it doesn't say that, but we say Francisca to the north and Terra Florida to the south. These are, of course, by our standards, unrealistic maps of North America. But at the same time, they spoke to the tenacity of trying to find or conjecturing that there was a passageway that went to India or Cathay or China, as you see at the far left. So let's look at a couple other maps that came out of the Dieppe map makers that did not have this in particular, but speak to finding a passageway to China also. The next one is by Le Testu, one of the main map makers of Dieppe, who shows that he doesn't include this Verrazzano Sea or this narrowing of North America, but rather he suggests that there is a land bridge that extends from the north of Canada right over to China. In fact, you can follow it across the Arctic to Europe as well. So China is, by this map, by conjecture, it is reachable by land. Maybe you could just get in a horse and wagon and get there. It's an absurd notion, but anyway, it's of this time. Let's go to the next map by Nicolas Delien, who shows a different kind of an idea that has to do with getting to China. On the next map, World Map 1566, Nicolas Delien, he shows that the top of Canada, if we can get to this map, the northern part of, yes, the north of Canada has a truncated kind of shape, and it's entirely possible just to sail right over it to get to the far east. So this map also accentuates the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Gaspé area, much larger than is realistic, but it begins to speak to the tendency in French maps to aggrandize anything that's French, and we'll see later to minimize anything that is English. So much for the possible passage in Verrazzano Sea. Let's look at monarchs and empire. What was the political situation and intent here? We have here the Valois and Bourbon kings from a period of about 1500 to the end of the Ancien regime. And they were each one was in favor of exploring this new world, but the only several of them really made great strides in supporting that. We begin with Francois I and Henry II, who supported the explorations of Verrazano and Cartier. But then there were three kings that followed Henry II. He was, of course, he died in a jousting accident and was followed by three undistinguished sons who, with the either aid or contentious presence of their mother, Catherine de' Medici, occupied the throne right up until Henri IV, 1598, who came in, he, Le Bon Roi, and he again supported exploration in the New World, sending Champlain and others to the New World. His efforts were also supported by Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and here at the end of this era, we see in this picture, it's a wonderful depiction of royalty and exploration and the nobility of science. This is Louis XVI, right at the end of the Ancien regime, sending La Pérouse, the explorer of the Pacific, westward to do a scientific expedition. That's Larousse in the red culotte. And here's, of course, Louis XVI, end of the Ancien regime, doesn't have a chamber pot to piss in, and yet he's putting money into La Pérouse's explorations of the Pacific. Good thing, too, because La Pérouse charted the whole west coast of the United States, drawing in what we know of Alaska, the Northwest, San Francisco Bay, he drew an important map of, something that had not been found by other explorers because of the fog that obscured the Golden Gate there. And then he sailed to the Far East and fortunately stopped off in Australia and sent back his early maps. That I say fortunately because he was lost in the Far East and possibly suffered the hat trick of the explorer, captured, killed, and eaten. But his expedition was lost, but not before he sent back some of these key maps of the Western United States. Interestingly, Louis the XVI was obsessed with La Pérouse and was very disappointed at his loss and sent out a rescue party. It was unsuccessful. The ruins of La Pérouse's journey were found 50, 100 years later, but Louis XVI had said on the last day of his life, as he was headed to the gallows, he asked his handlers, "By the way, any word of La Pérouse?" Fun story. Don't know if it's true or not, but it speaks to the flagging support of the French monarchs for exploration in the New World. So, if we go now to what were the objectives of Nouvelle France? France, different from other colonizers, had three objectives. They were colonies, commerce, and conversion. We see that in the next slide, how the approach of France to the colonies was different from others. In very broad strokes, Spain sought fortune, and their approach was to conquer Mexico and other lands. And their approach toward native peoples was really one of subjugation and enslavement and decimation. Also, speaking in broad strokes, the British ended up in the middle of the Americas, and their goal was plantations. Their approach toward the native people, if you could speak in very simple terms, was to claim and clear. They pushed the native people further west. Now, the French monarchs had a different approach for Nouvelle France, where they were dealt a different hand. They had the north, and the economic objective was to further the trade in the fisheries to the Far East, and also, and importantly, the fur trade, the beaver trade in particular, throughout the areas that we now know as the Maritimes and Ontario and the Great Lakes region. So in order to achieve that, they took a very different approach to native peoples. They associated, they lived among, they often learned the language of native peoples, and they traveled with them as those native people were pushed westward by a lot of political and economic factors. But also, France did not support its colonies as did the other nations, that is to say, economically, militarily. They empowered certain corporations with exclusive licenses. So they took a corporate approach toward colonization. And just as venal offices were sold in the Ancien regime within France, several different series of companies were empowered with licenses to develop the beaver trade or the fishery and so forth. So, because of that, they got the advantage of associating with native peoples, and they learned a great deal more about the interior of the Americas than did the British or the Spanish with their very different approach. Let's look at the beginnings of Nouvelle France and the two founders, if you will, Cartier and Champlain. If we can pull that up. Jacques Cartier established no settlements in Nouvelle France, but he did establish it for France. He planted a cross and claimed it for the king of France. There is no map of Cartier that still exists, but we do have some depictions of those maps. Can we go to the next slide that says Cartier's explorations? There's a modern depiction of how he sailed in through the north of Newfoundland into the St. Lawrence, the Bay of St. Lawrence, and around Nova Scotia and the Gaspé to some extent. We have, as I said, only sketchy ideas. Yeah, here's the Dauphin map is what's known of his explorations. This was rendered later and by others, but based on his notes or early maps that existed. There's also something called the Spanish chart on the lower left, which has notations about Spaniards exploring that later and finding what they thought were remnants of Cartier's voyage. So we know very little about it other than he established this area, this region for France. Now, who was listening? That's another question. Were the natives listening to that? Was Europe listening to that? Things change. If we'll go to the next slide, we see Champlain. Now, Champlain really was the founder of Nouvelle France. In 1608, he founded Quebec, and this began 150 plus years of French rule in America. Champlain really devoted half or more of his life to the survival of the colony and made as many as 23 Atlantic crossings over 3 decades. If you can imagine, it was at least a month across the Atlantic. So we're talking about a couple of years just at sea to go back and forth between Nouvelle France and France itself. And he was, in the beginning, an explorer who made beautiful maps. There are several maps that still exist. This is a rendering from one of his original maps, and it's from 1612, and it's called Carte géographique de Nouvelle-France, and it's considered one of the mother maps of Canada, or French Canada entirely. So he was, first of all, an explorer and later became the first administrator of Nouvelle-France, and he was extremely dedicated to the survival of the country. He had very little support from France. There's record of him writing a letter to Richelieu asking for a mere 120 soldiers to help the settlements to survive against the onslaught of native people and the British. He was not his wish was not granted. And one of the historians, Henry Dwight Sedgwick, said in a 1900 book that Champlain was a successful colonist. France was a failure at it. An interesting take on that indeed. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the amazing content that was included in Champlain's maps that he depicted not just, as I say, the waterways, but also you see the fisheries here, the Grand Banks outside of Newfoundland. And you see also the native people. If we go to the next slide, we see a little bit more detail on the lives of native people. There's yes, on the left is Champlain's, or an illustrated taken from Champlain's notes of a settlement of Iroquois. And if we look on the right, we see the lives of native people. The 4 people are really interesting in the sense that we have a woman nursing a baby. We have a warrior preparing for battle. We have a farmer, and we have a hunter. And note the European appearance of them, but this is an amazing document of what he was finding in the early 17th century, and also what they were growing, cultivating, and eating and collecting and so forth. Let's move on a little bit. We see below this. Um, Let me see from his maps. Yeah, here's another. Oh, yes. We begin a new phase now in the 17th century with the establishment of the academy. Now, the academy, as you may know, was established under Louis the 14th. It was on the incentive of of his first minister Colbert, who said we need an Académie Royale des Sciences. It was created in 1666, and with it came cartography as one of the sciences. And you see in the center here something called the Cassini map. Their first task was to make a very detailed map of metropolitan France, so that it could be ruled and taxed and defended. So this was the beginning of an era in map making that was extraordinary, that really put France into the forefront. And what was the crude maps that were made perhaps in Nouvelle France were shipped back to France, where they were rendered by expert map makers. You see their names at the bottom. Some of you may recognize Sanson, Delisle, Danville, map makers that we'll mention in the future. Now, these are map makers who, by and large, stayed in Paris, did not travel to the Americas, and yet rendered some of the most accurate and beautiful maps of this new world. So we'll go to the next couple of slides. We'll see some examples of their handiwork, including the colorful and elaborate cartouches that adorned all of the maps. But in the next one, we see some work by Claude Bernoux and Nicolas Sanson that shows how these were works of great art, and as well as markers of what countries were claiming what areas. Can we go to the next slide, the North America and parts of the South by Bernoux? Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. This is Sanson. We've skipped over too, but this shows the incredible detail that is here. And again, we're beginning to see the depiction of aggrandizement of French holdings and the minimizing of the British holdings. Hard to see here in the kind of detail we have, but also there are the native people who are here are well documented. I get a note here that we're not talking about I'm talking about the previous slide, but let's keep going through these. We've got to make a little time here. So North America by Nicolas Defer. If we land on that slide, we can see the emphasis on the Nouvelle France and the de-emphasis on the eastern seaboard colonies of the British. Can we advance here a little, Melissa? We're getting kind of sticky keys, I guess.
And now you should see the Beaver Wars.
Ah, the Beaver Wars. Is the Beaver Wars up? Okay, great. Now we're talking about the Beaver Wars. Again, we have to depart from what was happening from a French perspective. And after all, we've been talking about the 17th century. That's the grand siècle of Louis XIV, all the Le Gloire de France, the building of so much of Paris and so forth. But what was happening back in the Americas? The Beaver Wars, or the Iroquois Wars, were what was happening. This was a horrible period for the native people and for also the French settlers in this area. For about 70 years, there was an extremely ferocious and bloody and horrifying series of wars, largely between the Iroquois nations, which, as I said, consisted of 5 or 6 different nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, and the other native peoples of the region, which happened to be Nouvelle France, the Hurons, the Algonquins, and the others. And you see here depictions of, at first, Champlain taking part in one of the first battles of the Beaver Wars, the bloodiness of the other aspects of it. The blue is a treaty, the depiction of a treaty, which of course has pictograms in it, and it's fascinating. So, for about 70 years, there was unending series of wars and treaties and peace and fighting, and the upshot of it is that it ended with basically a victory by the Iroquois Confederacy and a forced migration of other peoples westward. And if we see the slide that says the migration west, we can see how the Iroquois went from their homelands in what we think of as upstate New York, the Finger Lakes, and the Adirondacks and stuff, across the Ontario to capture lands that were occupied. The Wendat's and the Algonquin and Wendat people were forced into what was known as the middle waters of the Great Lakes area. So now we're up to the middle waters. You see the migration west and the land that increasingly became Iroquois land. And with this migration, many French Canadian, French settlers traveled with them. This was the era when the the frontier priests lived alongside and with native people and traveled with them to an area known as the Middle Waters, or Upper Quebec, or Abitibi in the Algonquin language. And this, if we get to the slide that says the Middle Waters, this is a very important chapter in the French mapping of not the coastline now, but the interior of the nation. And it shows how, in particular, Marquette traveled through the middle of America, through the Great Lakes, and was guided through by native people through what is now the Wisconsin. He got to, if you see here at the top right, there's a depiction of his route through Lake Michigan and through an area that would now be Green Bay, and then through a series of rivers and portages across Wisconsin to get to the mighty Mississippi. And he had proved that there was a way to reach this mighty. Now, it wasn't clear where the Mississippi went to, but if we go to, yeah, there's the middle waters. The top right is his route through what is now Wisconsin, and his arrival at the Mississippi. Now, this is a depiction of that Mississippi, which, as we see here, and empties into the Gulf of Mexico, something that Marquette did not know, but surmised. When he arrived at the Mississippi, he traveled southward past the Ohio River, past the Missouri River, and down as far as the Arkansas River, where he turned around. But from what he learned of native peoples and what he surmised, he realized that the Mississippi flowed into the Gulf of Mexico. He turned back because he was afraid of being captured by the Spaniards and tortured and killed, or because of native people who were unfriendly to their presence. Whatever, he never got there. But that was made moot in a short time later by LaSalle, who did. So we're now up to La Louisiane, if we could. Migration west, the middle waters. Skipping through a lot of history here, but if we can get to the slide that says La Louisiane and Delisle 1718, we enter a period known as the Cartographic Wars, the War of Cartography, over who laid claim to really the middle of America. And this was the beginning of a dispute between France and England. Well, not the beginning of the dispute over territory, but it really brought it to a head. This was the opening gambit in the Cartographic War. 1718, Guillaume Delisle, one of the royal cartographers, issues a map which shows the extent of the French claims by LaSalle in 1682 to the entire Mississippi Valley. And you see it more clearly on the right in a later map, which is a copy of Delisle's map by a German. The Weigel map shows that everything in green was what the French had claimed. Now, the colonies were along the east coast of America. Now, the British were absolutely livid when this map was issued because it just showed the audaciousness of the claims that were made by LaSalle and what the French claimed of the whole middle of America. In other words, LaSalle had claimed Louisiana as extending from the Gulf of Mexico north to the Great Lakes and eastward to the Appalachians and westward to the Rockies. The entire watershed of the Mississippi was claimed for France, even though many Frenchmen had never been to many of these parts. But this was an area many times larger than metropolitan France, and it flew in the face of the colonial ambitions of the British colonists who were just bursting at the seams as their population was exploded, and they wanted farmland on the other side of the Appalachians. So, if we can go to the next slide, we'll see that the British answered this. Oh, I'm sorry. This shows, as well as land, the unbelievable understanding, the detail of the waterways of this La Louisiane that the French possessed. They'd explored these areas, and their maps just kept getting better and better of what was known. Now, rivers, you understand, are commerce. It's a way of transporting goods from a remote area to a marketplace. It's a place of farming because rivers flood and create rich bottom soil. Rivers are everything. They are the highways of America, and the French showed through this map and others that they understood full well the river system of the center of the country. If we go to the next slide, Great Britain responds. Great Britain did indeed respond to this, the audacity of the Delisle map through a whole series of maps which fought back, so to speak. Here's one called A New Map of North Parts of America Claimed by France by Hermann Moll, 1720. Moll was a German-born English engraver who had a London shop and drew, and from that he made maps and globes. He never traveled to the United States, but he was tasked with creating a map that was a forceful parry to La Louisiane by Delisle. And here, if you can see, and bear with me, it's a little hard, he's pushed out some of the eastern colonies. South Carolina has now made a thrust toward the Mississippi, and he's, again, expanded the areas that are claimed by Britain, flying in the face of these audacious French claims. Moll was also important for two other maps that had great political import. If we go to the next slide, they were called the Beaver Map and the Codfish Map. And they displayed areas at the level of the northeastern areas of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland that had gone into British hands with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, and he was proud to crow about it. He has notes in here about the limitations of the French and the boldness of the British. But aside from politicizing, he has two adorable depictions here. One on the beaver map shows these beavers doing what they do best. They're busying themselves in the construction of new things in America. And in the background, it's a little strange that it's here, but there's the Niagara Falls with the implication perhaps being that the beavers had created that as well. But it's entirely allegorical. It seems to say that if you go to America and work hard, great things are possible. That was part of this story of promoting colonization. Also, I think anybody that looked at this from a financial point of view would say, man, those beavers, I could go there and set up some traps and be rich in a week. There are that many beavers. And on the right, it showed the very lucrative codfish market that was based on the incredible fishing, the richness of the waters around the Grand Banks, and the process, which was really begun by the Portuguese, of drying and salting codfish so it could be a preserved protein source that could be put upon a ship, and then a ship that was sailing for 2 years' time would have a supply of codfish that just had to be soaked in fresh water and reconstituted as a protein. So these were Henry Moll's claim to fame, really, his two most famous maps. If we see in the next slide, we see also that Herman Moll promoted the size of the Carolinas and another series of maps. And And at the right, also in this game, is a fellow named Henry Popple. And he was not a cartographer, but a clerk who worked for the Board of Trade and Plantations in London and never went to America also. But he was tasked with creating a map that would counter this Delisle map of America. And he did his best. It was the only map he ever made, and it was just a copy of Delisle's map, as was the previous map we looked at by Mull, in which he left in many of the same political borders, and a lot of French terms like the embouchure of the Rivière Mississippi, the mouth of the Mississippi, and didn't change much of anything. The Board of Trade was very dissatisfied. They didn't want to publish the map, but the French loved it, and they published a French version because it really showed their side of the story. We're getting toward the end of the War of Cartography, but we have to mention the map by Danville on the next slide, which takes things up a notch still. And it shows the incredible skills of French cartography and how they understood even better than the British maps, even the British areas of the Americas. So this speaks to the level of map making in France. If we could vault ahead again to the next slide, shows what ended this cartography war, and that was the Mitchell map. This was a series of maps. They were constructed by, again, a non-cartographer, a doctor named John Mitchell, who was born in Virginia and then traveled to England, where he was charged with making these maps that showed the British claims. In the first version of it, 1750, he extends the colonies to the Mississippi, just laying over the French claims over Louisiana. And in the second one, in 1755, he extends those claims to, it looks like, infinity and beyond. Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia extend past the Mississippi and into whatever lies to the west, presumably the Pacific Ocean, that emphasized the British claim seemingly sea to sea. Well, this kind of wraps up the War of Cartography, and which was made moot by the conclusion of the French and Indian Wars and the end of the expansion of British America, and really the end of French America in 1763. And we see that in this depiction, when we get to the expansion of British America, we see the conclusion of the French and Indian. Yes. And here are British troops in the streets of Montreal, in the Treaty of Paris, why the French relinquished all of their holdings in Americas to the British. The Spanish lost Florida to the British as well, and parts of what was claimed of La Louisiane on the west of the Mississippi went to the Spaniards. So France, really, the Nouvelle France was done at this point. If we go to the next slide, we can see how grand the claims were in 1755, but just a decade or so later, why all of that area, the coral area, had gone to Britain, the yellow area had gone to Spain, and the Nouvelle France had ceased to basically exist. Now, there was still French there, of course, and they huddled in certain areas, what became the province of Quebec, and of course the Louisiana corridor and New Orleans. But with the end of the French and Indian War came a kind of a double whammy. Why came the restriction of settlements west of the Appalachians. And I'm just jogging through this quickly because I guess we're coming to the end of our time here. But King George III restricted the settlement west of the Appalachians. You see here in the center a series of boundary lines, and they went with the watershed. If the waters flowed to the Atlantic, they could be settled by the colonists. If they settled, if the waters flowed to the Mississippi, that was Native American or Indian land and not to be settled. This was, and let me give a moment to Iris, if we could. This was one of the causations, was it not, of the American Revolution, the fact that the king restricted areas that the colonists very much wanted, already were developing. You have a thought on that, Iris?
Yes, well, you just said it, but so true. one of the main reasons, of course, of the outbreak of the American Revolution was that the people living in North America, the colonists, wanted to go beyond that particular line for settlement. And the British had forbidden to cross that particular line. As you can see, the King's Proclamation of 1763, which of course coincides with the Treaty of Paris, which is when the end of the Seven Years' War, the French and Indian War happened. And so from that moment onwards, we can see the tensions starting to escalate in North America because, of course, there was that line they were not supposed to cross, but also a lot of new taxes were imposed just after that war because the British had, of course, won, but they had also spent way too much money. So in order to recuperate what they had invested, let's say, they would tax their North American inhabitants much more than before that. And so that, of course, leads to all the famous moments that will then lead to the
Yes.
American Revolution.
If we go to, exactly, if we go to the next slide, we see that already there had been investment in these lands by George Washington and many of the founders and wealthy Virginians and Pennsylvanians and so forth. We see that they were commanded by the king to leave there and come back east of that line, but they had already invested great sums in developing the Ohio Valley. So we see that, and we go to the land to the next slide if we could. We see this is how it resolved. Of course, this is how the frontier of America was developed by a series of seedings, victories, purchases, and so forth, right up to the Alaska Purchase and Hawaii and the Virgin Islands being the last purchase. Don't tell anybody in Washington right now, but it's purchased in 1917 from Denmark, of all places. So that was our last purchase that that gave shape to the America we know. If we have just a moment, I wanted to go to the next slide and say that whereas we're done with maps as we know them, the French also provided some very key what I would call psychographic maps of America. Here are three Frenchmen who wrote about America during this period. Crèvecoeur, a Frenchman who fought for Quebec, went over to the British side, became a British citizen. I'm sorry, a British subject, bought a farm. We're talking about the 1760s, upstate New York, and prospered, and wrote his notes on this. Of course, come the Revolution, he was exposed as a royalist. He fled the country. His neighbors burned his house down and whatnot. But he went to Europe and published a book called Letters from an American Farmer, which, as much as anything, defined the American dream of coming to this country and prospering. And he was the first to use the term melting pot that comes from this. The second was by the Marquis de Châteauroux, a little-known figure from the Revolutionary War, perhaps, but we have in Iris the world expert on Châteauroux. Can you tell us just a word about what he wrote about his observations of America at this time?
Absolutely. Well, he was not really at the same time as Crèvecoeur, but almost. But he was there in the American Revolution. Um, And yeah, we have like 1 minute, so I will
Yeah.
tell just a little second that Châteauroux was one of the major generals of the army of Rochambeau, and so he played an influential part in shaping the campaign that would lead to Yorktown and the victory at Yorktown. But what is interesting in the context of what we're telling here is that he also was studying America in a very thorough way because he was sent by Rochambeau and on his own initiative to the 13 different colonies in order to understand the war better, the terrain better, the people better, in order to fight the war better. And so he was traveling in the 13 different states and wrote many reports on them, but he was also making maps. And so he's really one of the earlier Frenchmen, after all those that have been discussed by Roger today, that very accurately portrayed the American Revolution and its states and its inhabitants and everything you can imagine, trade routes, rivers, roads, all useful for the war, but also useful for what they were hoping for France to be the future of the French-American relations, which was trade. And so this is what you can see, what Châteauroux is doing is a reflection of what they needed for their military campaign, but they also were ordered by Versailles to map America at that time because they didn't have many accurate maps. What we've heard through Roger is that there's a huge, long period of map making, of course, going on, but we're now talking about the 18th century and we're talking about the Enlightenment. And the period where Châteauroux was sent in 1780 to America coincides with a period of very important reforms in the French army and led to the creation of institutions and military academies that were really training very accurate map makers. They were training the engineers that would make the French maps, which at the time makes the French maps made by the military engineers the most accurate that there actually existed, even compared to the British or especially to the Americans. So it's very interesting to see the evolution from what we've seen, quite imagined lands or creatures living in these lands, like these big animals we discussed. But of
Yes.
course, the French military experts were really good at map making, and the maps mean so much more than the military story that we tend to use them for today as historians, because the Rochambeau map collection, for instance, at the Library of Congress and at Yale University are known as military maps. But if you actually understand them in that larger context of the French gathering all information they could about America, especially for their hopes of their future relations with them, the maps mean much more. They mean where particular people lived, where the different religions were, where different trade routes could be, where the ports were, where different agricultural experiments were held, and so on. So the maps tell really a very good overview of what the nascent American nation is doing at that time.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's true. If we could just go to the last slide, I just wanted to extend a special thanks to, yeah, that's oh, these are the maps that Iris had mentioned, the so-called military maps that have so much import in other aspects.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank, if we go to the last slide, the New York Public Library, which was the place where I did most of my research for this and saw original maps and saw wonderful reproductions of them. New York Public Library and other libraries, like research libraries like the Boston Public Library or the Getty in Los Angeles, are wonderful places to go and see original materials. If you can, get yourself a library card and go to the wonderful Carrier and Hastings building, which looks like it's in France because he studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, and pick up, as you see at the lower left, an original copy of Notre Dame de Paris or the Encyclopédie by Diderot, and just look at them in a wonderful context like room 315 in the center or the map division. You know, Robert Darnton, whom we've mentioned, was the head of Harvard Libraries, and he told me that it's so important to pick up a 17th or 16th century book and hold it in your hands because you're really shaking hands with someone from that century. And if you want to understand history, why not shake hands with somebody who was there? So I thank the Alliance Française. Thank you, Iris, for your great input and insights into this. I wish we had more time, but we'll explore more of the French and American relations in coming programs. So Renee, I hand it to you. Thank you.
So Roger and Iris, thank you so much. There was one question from a board member. I know we're a little bit over our time. Can we see the chat, Melissa? For some reason, I can't see the chat any longer.
Sure. Do you remember who the question was from, Renee?
It was the last question in the chat.
Oh, were the different claims using maps supported by actual military forces behind them?
Iris, go ahead.
Oh,
I don't know if you hear
Iris,
that.
you're on mute.
Sorry. I did something with my computer. I'm sorry. I didn't hear the question. The sound just decided to, I
Sure,
don't know.
no problem. So Mose asks, were the different claims using maps supported by actual military forces behind them?
So which type of claims? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Maybe we can see if Mo can come
Oh,
off mute and ask his question.
Different claims using maps supported by actual military
Yeah,
forces.
yeah. Sorry, this is Mo.
Hi.
Because we saw a lot of claims published by maps, and now you can publish whatever you want. But were they forces supporting one side or the other behind these claims?
oh, you may be asking about what I call the cartographic war.
Yes.
And the claims of the British versus the claims of no, there was no actual war where one side went in and fought the other over land claims. It was simply one that was fought on paper, so to speak.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
But having said that, that had a lot to do with public opinion and knowledge and motivation. So there's power to maps. So putting a line on a piece of paper is my point.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you so much to both Roger and Iris, and I think all of us are going to be watching this again on YouTube to learn more and to look at the detail of these incredible maps. So thank you so much. And again, this has been recorded, so we can all go back and take another look and listen to. I think, Roger, you said this was your 7th presentation to AFUSA, and we can't wait until the next one. And
Oh.
Iris, so grateful for your time, and we hope to see you both again really soon.
Thank you
A
so
pleasure.
much.
Thank you.
you.
Have a good evening.